Hello again, I'm Don Stacy, and I'll read the very last story in my collection, Tales of the Bizarre and Unnatural. This one is titled, innocently enough, The Hallway. For the past several weeks, Cronin has experienced the same dream almost nightly. He walks along a narrow, twisting hallway no one would have intentionally designed, and soon he comes upon the first of several open doorways. The subsequent rooms, which he ventures into, all have ample decor, as if each were a different set for a film being shot on a soundstage. The number of rooms varies from one night to the next, and in each of these expanding rooms the same unknown woman appears. Sometimes she never says a word, as a few others garner nearly all of Cronin's attention. The very first room is often a posh New Orleans-style bordello, followed after another brief walk through the hallway, which favors turns at peculiar, unexpected angles, by a row of jail cells, then a rooming house, a clothing store, a movie theater, an indoor swimming pool, a hotel's ground floor cafe, the varied interior shots of a cityscape. But he has seen her in outdoor settings as well, along a steep sidewalk after dusk in a fog, and she takes a single step away from the tree and says, "Cronin, where are you going?" And here he pauses, as he has not done before, because she has never spoken to him before. And he wants to see her face, not some dissolving image. He wants an ongoing perception of this woman. He wants to know who she is and why he's dreaming about her. He wants to pause and look at her, talk to her. She's in the world as he is, Cronin. "Aren't you afraid of getting cold out here?" he says. "I just stepped out of my house to smoke a cigarette." She has dark hair, which could be red, he considers. Without enough light, he can't be sure. "I'm headed home from work," he says, in reference to her question and the puzzling use of his name. "Have we met?" "Yes," she says. You don't seem to have a very good memory." "That your house, then?" he says, tipping his head a bit toward the house which directly faces them. There is a wide veranda, the walls are a dark brick, the windows bordered with gray shutters. "Yes, would you like to come inside and have a look?" "All right," he says. She is about his age, 35. He follows her along the private walkway to the steps of the front porch. Along the veranda he sees 4 chairs, all made of wicker, a clay pot by one of the chairs containing cigarette butts. "Come inside," she says, glancing at him once more before opening the door. "We can talk for a while." "Sure, we can get reacquainted." "You were drunk the night we met," she says, leading them into her house. "We were having a party. There was a big crowd. You just walked in off the street, already 3 sheets to the wind. Later on, after we had talked for a while, you rose with a wobble and wandered back out the door. I can only conclude that you had a sudden realization that you needed to get home." Cronin feels stunned for a moment. He has absolutely no recollection of this. She leads him to a pair of chairs in front of a bay window, and they both sit down. "I'm glad you invited me to visit for a while," he says. "At least I'll have the pleasure of remembering you this time. Quite a place you've got here." The living room has a Turkish opulence, oriental carpets, furniture with sculpted wooden frames, bronze statues, a vase containing peacock feathers. "I've lived here for 5 years, through a marriage and a divorce," she says. "I'm not planning to live anywhere else." Permanence has a certain attraction. "Say, my name's Tom." "I'm Andrea. So, how did you happen to come to town? What's your story?" "I wanted to live in a coastal city, so I came here. I wanted a smaller town. I found work here, so I stayed." What sort of work do you do? I got hired at the newspaper to work in their press room. The guy I replaced had a heart attack. He's slowly recovering, but he won't be able to work again. Isn't that how it goes, she says. One man's loss is another man's gain. I lost a husband, but I gained a house. It's a big place for one person. Oh, I rent out 3 rooms to college girls. That way I can scratch out a living and lead a personal life with a few friends here in town. I've got to tell you, Tom, I've seen you a few times walk up this street on your way home from work. I've wanted to meet you for a while now. One night I was smoking by that same tree and you passed me. We glanced at each other, but we never spoke. Do you remember that? Yeah, I do, he says. Andrea, after I got off work, I stopped off at a tavern for a beer, so I've got to ask you to point out your bathroom to me. Oh, of course, she says, getting up. Cronin follows her out into the hallway, and she says, that door facing us at the end of the hallway. Thanks, he says, and hurries toward the door. He steps into the bathroom and shuts the door. He ignores the assortment of cosmetics scattered along the backside of the sink's counter, the hairdryer, the scented soap. With dispatch, he urinates, rinses his hands, and dries them on one of the 4 towels hanging along the wall and the door to the shower stall. When he returns to his chair, he finds that Andrea has poured them each a glass of whiskey. He sits down, smiling, and picks up his glass and says, thanks for the drink. She merely smiles and says, have you ever been satisfied? His face takes on a puzzled look, though a moment later he says, sure, for brief periods of time. Haven't you? Yes, but satisfaction never lasts. Everyone discovers that quick enough, so we have music and art and religion to see us through, she says. What do you value most of all, he says. Friendship, she says. Mutual laughter, mutual understanding, peace, justice. What do you value more than anything else? Life, he says. Having work, having a job. She is smiling. She seems pleased to hear this, he reflects. After a moment she says, when you pass by again sometime on your way home from work, why don't you come up to the porch, ring the doorbell? It might be busy at the moment, but one of the girls can let you in. All right, he says, quite pleased by this sudden invitation of hers. Then, not wishing to overstay his welcome, he knocks back his drink and gets up from the chair, saying, it's been a pleasure, Andrea, but I need to be on my way. My apartment's a few blocks further up the hill, and I've got to fix dinner, but you can be sure I'll come by real soon. Once out on the sidewalk, Cronin continues along his customary path toward his apartment. As he walks further up the hill, further away from downtown in the bay, he recalls his moments with Andrea, meeting her by the tree, striking up a conversation. He feels some lingering concern over not remembering having entered her house. He certainly remembers the hangover he had the following day. All day it felt like death warmed over. Once back at his apartment, he cooks some hamburger and boils some vegetables for dinner. After reading the newspaper delivered each morning, he watches some TV, then goes to bed. Back along the twisting hallway with its occasional open doorway. Sometimes the frames of these entryways are suddenly formed of brick or stone rather than wood. So at least Cronin knows he is experiencing something apart from ordinary life. The hallway itself, painted a dark yellow, the creaking floor plain precision width oak. One of the entrances turns out to be that of a cemetery. He has no wish to stroll among tombstones, so he backs out through the stone archway back into the hallway. Cronin asleep, his mind presenting him with the dream of the hallway. He proceeds along it with resolve. The next entryway is just up ahead. The dark yellow walls are usually bare, though once he passed a 16th century map of the world, the New World clearly occupying the Western Hemisphere. On another occasion he passed a fire extinguisher inside a locked wooden box with a glass window, and just beneath the box, hanging on 2 hooks, an axe. For a moment he had paused and studied this equipment stored so openly. Some doors in a hotel would have to be smashed through with an axe, a fire originating, as it most often would, in one of the rooms. But soon he tires of looking at a similar tableau, and he moves on along the hallway. After a pair of 30-degree turns, he comes to another open doorway, this time through which he steps into a car dealer's showroom. Immediately a salesman strides up to him and greets him, and as the man is discussing the hydrogen-fueled engine of the car they are standing next to, Cronin looks away from the salesman and sees that same woman wearing a fedora and a light gray trench coat. And she stands about 20 feet away next to another car in the showroom. Her familiar look at first startles him, since with an undeniable sense of authority he understands that he should know this woman. "Excuse me," he says to the salesman, and takes a step toward her when he realizes that she is no longer there. Cronin now hurries away from the salesman, who long has been inured to the departing customer. Once again in the hallway with its creaking floorboards, he feels only a momentary relief from having pulled himself away from the salesman's hurried yet cheery pitch. Then up ahead he sees the next entryway, made of ornately carved, stained and varnished wood. Inside he discovers a saloon, a man sitting at one end of the bar and a woman at the other. She wears a tight dress which extends to her knees. Cronin sits between the man and the woman. The man wears a business suit and is having a conversation with the bartender. As he waits for the bartender to break off his conversation with the man in the suit, he turns his head for a moment to glance at the woman. She looks eerily, uncannily familiar. The skimpy dress she wears could not possibly keep her warm. Yes, he realizes now, she's the same woman who had been in a trench coat. She is looking straight ahead, lifting her martini glass to her lips on occasion. He grows anxious at the thought of speaking to her. Plus he is dressed in his working clothes, boots, jeans, flannel shirt. His hands are mostly clean from a nightly scrubbing before he goes home from work, but the creases in his skin and the tips of his fingernails are stained with ink. She'd think he was a rube. He slips off from his bar stool without thinking and walks toward her, and she seems astonishingly familiar when she turns to look at him and smile. "On the chance that you wouldn't mind me breaking into your solitary meditation, I've got a joke for you," he says. "Okay, let's hear it," she says, not the least offended by his sudden importuning presence at her side. He is looking into her eyes, enjoying the moment with her. He says, "So we've got 3 guys in a bar. One's a Republican, one's a Democrat, and one's an independent. They're watching a football game. The last play of the second quarter has just been completed. The Republican turns to the other 2 men and says, 'Trump campaign ads have begun to dominate the airwaves. Biden doesn't stand a chance.' The Democrat and the independent laugh, and the Democrat says, 'Trump wants the pandemic to surge back again in the fall. He knows with fewer voters he's got a better chance.' The Republican gives this notion a derisive laugh, but says nothing. After a pause, the independent says, 'I can see it now, Biden by a landslide. A lot of women in Trump country going to start to ridicule their husbands and boyfriends if they stick with Trump.' And they all laugh at this, even the Republican. You won't get a belly laugh from that. Well, you remind me of someone, but I'm not sure who. If you can't remember, then you need to quit drinking, she says, with a simple assurance. I come here once in a while. The clientele tend to be prosperous. They're long accustomed to spending money. Me, I run a small boarding house for a living, rent out rooms to college girls. Their boyfriends have to be out by 11 o'clock. Guests are never allowed to stay overnight, except for mine. My guests sometimes spend the night. I have a big house with 6 bedrooms. Its design is early 20th century. What do you do for a living, mister? Oh, I'm one of the pressmen at the newspaper here in town. Oh, a tradesman. Are you in a union? Yes, a willing dues-paying member, he says. You know anything about the labor movement? Not much. Women have their own labor movement when they have babies. He smiled at her joke, her dark red hair below her shoulders. I'd be surprised if you told me you have children. Only when my sister brings her kids over for a visit, she said. And then she seems to slide away from him as the bar grows longer and longer. Now she is hardly within shouting distance. Resigned to her imminent disappearance, he knocks back the remainder of his drink and goes back out to the hallway. Early the following week, he is walking back home from work. Cronin pauses next to Andrea's house. He hasn't been to a tavern earlier that evening. Since her invitation, he has intended to see her. Leaving the sidewalk, he takes the flagstone walkway up to her house. A girl is sitting outside smoking a cigarette with a book in her lap. She glances up and Cronin says, "Hello there, I've come to see Andrea. Is she at home?" She's always at home. No one can do a thing that she doesn't find out about. As he passes her, he glances at the book she's been reading, now closed and face up on her lap, the Turnaway Study. He says nothing and goes into the house. She could be anywhere, so he calls out her name as soon as he has gently shut the door, which includes an etched oval glass window pane. "Andrea," he calls out once again. "I'm in the bathroom," she calls back. "I'll be downstairs in a minute. Why don't you make a couple of drinks for us?" "Sure thing," he says, and goes into her living room where she keeps a decanter of whiskey and pours a couple of drinks. He carries his glass and steps slowly about as though he were in a small museum. She has souvenirs from other countries, from Asia and South America. On the walls are paintings and photographs. She comes down the stairs in a robe of sapphire red material with a faint sheen, her feet in a pair of fur-lined slippers. "I was looking at these pictures. You've done some traveling." "My ex-husband and I went to various places during our marriage. But in the beginning we were in love, and it was so easy and simple." "Yeah, I know what you mean. The few months of being in love and then everyday life slowly takes shape. I was married once too," he said. "I was about to turn 26 when I got married." "I was a little younger, 21, she says. "We had a beautiful, expensive wedding at the Methodist Church, a party across the street in the Wesleyan reception building. My husband, Randy, was an engineer and made a good living." "I've learned to live with my wages," Cronin said. "When my boots wear out, I have them repaired. When my mother passes away, I'll have to buy a suit." Randy was successful, but he was obsessed by his career. He worked very hard. He was dedicated, ever so dedicated. He could grow into a career, but he couldn't grow within a marriage. In the end, we just couldn't talk to each other. There was not even the passionless duty of appearing to remain decent to one another. Without children, there was nothing to keep us together. "So people move on," he says. "Yes, sometimes we do," she says. "As a landlady, I've become an informal counselor in personal relation. These girls who rent out rooms for me would much rather talk to me than their mothers. I give them a fresh, unvarnished view of themselves. Once one of them said I was unintentionally cruel. That was a few years ago when I first started to rent out rooms. I kept a for rent sign out until I found 3 people I was reasonably certain I could get along with, since we all would be sharing the bathrooms and the kitchen. We've come to share meals together as a matter of efficiency and economy. If someone won't be home for dinner, they put an X by their name on this little chalkboard we have in the kitchen. Some of the girls who have lived here didn't know the first thing about cooking when they moved in, but they learned quick enough that to help Andrea in the kitchen was an easy way to stay on her good side. Cronin has been listening to her with alert concentration. As she now seems to pause, he says, I cook for myself, stovetop style. When I want something with a distinctive taste, I heat up a frozen dinner in the microwave. Now, what did I do with those cigarettes? Tom, surely you know those frozen meals have a slew of chemicals in them, she says. Yeah, I know, but that's the price you pay for convenience. Cancer, obesity, high blood pressure. Talking to you, I might end up doing more of my own cooking. Why don't you come here for dinner on Saturday, she says, taking a drink from her glass. Bring along 2 bottles of wine. If all the girls are here, it won't last very long. I'll be happy to, he says, thinking, how splendid. Thanks for inviting me. I'll be looking forward to it. So will I, she says. I wonder how the girls are going to treat you. I don't believe any of them are accustomed to talking with working men. After visiting with her a little further, he says he ought to be going. From the whiskey, they both feel convivial, and Andrea leans toward him and hugs him a moment before he glances away from her with a retreating, nervous smile and goes out. That night, when he climbs the stairs to his apartment, he notices a package in front of his door. He picks up the package and carries it into the apartment and closes the door. He puts the package on the kitchen table and then hangs up his coat. The package is big enough to hold a toaster, and he has no idea who sent it or what is in it. He examines the delivery address, 749 Harrison Street, apartment 3. He examines the recipient's name, occupant. So, he is not able to take it to the rightful recipient, for he is the intended recipient. Some charitable organizations use this technique, the useful though unwanted gift later prompting a donation. Cronin sets the package aside for the time being, but not before he also examines the sender's address. Portrait Studios, Wilmington, Delaware. Well then, he thought, it's time to make dinner. So much is made about food. But then we needed to stay alive by eating, hopefully, a diverse diet, which assures a maximization of vital minerals and vitamins. Cronin is convinced this is why the Chinese had developed such an ingenious and productive civilization from its inception. He was also convinced that some ideas rooted in Chinese culture would have to be adopted for the synthetic world culture, which would gradually unfold over time. This pan-cultural notion has come into being on the wings of the internet, but its formation has only just begun. Every country in the world knows what is happening to one another, except for Russia, China, and North Korea, Iran, and several others you might not first expect. These countries all keep their government decision-making well away from public scrutiny through the simple expedient of controlling the press in all its forms. But it's far easier for them to broadcast misinformation than to conceal or prevent truthful, accurate accounts of what transpires behind the scenes of a plenum in Beijing, a circle of Putin's advisors, or even the convulsions of the Trump administration. Yes, he reflects the convulsions of the Trump administration. After dinner, Cronin switches on a computer he keeps in the spare bedroom, furnished with a desk and 2 small bookcases. He reads the New York Times most evenings while letting a jazz or classical music station play on the stereo radio in the living room. He watches an episode of Ray Donovan on his large flat-screen TV, and later that night he dreams, but not of the hallway. When he walks to work the next morning, he goes down the hill toward the bay, the presence in the air of the paper mill, the acrid stench diluted from the wind blowing landward from the bay. Andrea has a good view of the bay, he thinks as he glances at her house. The way she has come to earn a living was resourceful, he reflects. Had he been in her shoes, he merely would have sold the place, bought a much smaller home and put the remainder to work, let a broker handle it, and keep working the day job, whatever it was she once did. She said she was only 21 when she got married. On Saturday late morning, he grabs out a canvas shopping bag from the kitchen drawer and walks to the neighborhood grocery store. He picks out a Merlot and a Pinot Grigio, thinking give them a chance to exercise a preference. He shows up a few minutes before 7. This time no one is sitting on the veranda, and he presses a button for the door chimes. Soon he can feel the faint rumble of someone's approach. The door opens and a girl invites him in. There is a delicious aroma in the air, as if a forethought to the meal ahead. He follows her into the dining room where one other girl is seated. Andrea, an apron still around her, brings in a tray with a roast and potatoes and carrots. Cronin places the bottles of wine on the table, then takes off his jacket and hangs it over the back of the chair. He watches Andrea set the tray on the table, then she takes off her apron and sets it on a shelf of a serving window from the kitchen. The 2 girls sit across from one another, as does he and Andrea, who quickly introduces her 2 tenants. One of them is studying chemistry, the other ecology. Tom works at the newspaper, she says. He's one of the printers there. What's it like when the presses are running, Rebecca asks, the one studying chemistry. Extremely noisy. I wear ear protectors. We make adjustments on the ink flow, a series of 20 screws or more we use to tighten or loosen the blade against the ink rollers, controlling the ink flow for photographs. Is it dangerous? Well, it can be if you don't pay attention. I knew an old printer who had cut off his finger in a paper cutter, Cronin says. I hope I never have to work with heavy equipment, Erin says, the student of ecology. What if you wanted to study the ecology of the swamp? You would need to use one of those boats with a big fan on the back. Or you might have to drive one of those all-terrain vehicles if you were to study the desert, he says. Well, I could learn how to use them, just not how to repair them, the girl replies. Get your degree first, Andrea says, then after that you can worry about mechanics. There are already plenty of men around who are